The red dust from the dirt road rises like a dry mist, sticking to the shiny black bodywork of a German sedan that doesn't belong there. The car stops in front of an old wooden gate. Inside the vehicle, the air conditioning creates a bubble of artificial cold. Beatrice, the mother, looks out the window, her face a mask of contained revulsion, her fingers tapping nervously on her designer handbag. Next to her, Ricardo, the father, keeps both hands on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched. In the back seat, 7-year-old Ilara is huddled in her leather seat. She doesn't look outside. Her eyes are tightly closed and her small hands cover her ears. A futile attempt to block out the sound of the engine, the creaking suspension, and the universe of anxiety that consumes her. Outside, leaning against the porch of a simple wooden house, a man watches her. It is Silas. His face is a map of wrinkles carved by the sun and time. He doesn't move. He just waits. The car door opens. Ricardo gets out, adjusting his expensive suit. He opens the back door and with barely concealed impatience says, "Come on, Ilara, we're here." The girl doesn't move. He grabs her by the arm, pulling her out of her leather cocoon. The moment her bare feet touch the hot, dusty ground, Ilara's body stiffens, a spasm of sensory shock. She is being handed over. Not to a school, not to a summer camp. She is being handed over like an unwanted package, in a silent exchange where shame and money are the only currency. The trip back to the city is made in a deathly silence, broken only by the hum of tires on the asphalt. It is later, in the penthouse apartment overlooking the cold lights of the metropolis, that the truth of that day is revealed. The apartment is a triumph of minimalism. White marble floors, glass walls, designer furniture with sharp angles. A place with no soft corners, no comfort. A sterile museum. Beatrice pours 2 glasses of wine. She hands one to Ricardo, who is standing, looking at the city stretching out below them. "We did the right thing," she says, her voice firm, almost rehearsed. "There she will have fresh air, space. It's for her own good." Ricardo takes a long sip of wine. "For her own good," he repeats, the phrase lacking conviction. "The doctor said she needed routine, stability. And what stability could we give her?" Beatrice retorts, her voice rising an octave. "Have you forgotten about dinner at the Monteros' house? Did you forget how embarrassing it was?" The memory of that night is an open wound. It was a crucial business dinner for Ricardo. Ilara, whom they had been forced to take with them because the babysitter canceled, was quiet at first, but the dessert, ice cream that was too cold, and the loud laughter and clinking of glasses overwhelmed her. She began to buzz, a low, vibrating sound. Then she started to sway. The hostess, trying to be kind, touched her shoulder. The touch was the last straw. Ilara let out a high-pitched scream, a sound of pure panic, and knocked over a tray of crystal glasses. The sound of shattering glass silenced the room. All eyes turned to them. Ricardo remembers the pitying looks of the other guests, the lame excuse he stammered, the condescending smile of his boss. He remembers carrying Ilara out, her body rigid with fear, while Beatrice stayed behind, trying to patch things up with smiles and apologies. "We can't live like this," Beatrice continues, now pacing back and forth on the cold marble floor. "Our life? Our career? Everything we've built. She's an anchor, Ricardo. An anchor that's dragging us down. That man, Silas, he's simple. He'll know how to deal with her simplicity." Their outburst is not about the pain of separating from a daughter. It is the meticulous justification of an act of convenience. They did not give her up out of love or desperation. They amputated her. They amputated the part of their lives that did not fit into the perfect picture they so desperately wanted to sell to the world. Abandonment was not the first option. It was the last, after a long and expensive journey for what they called help. A journey that was, in fact, a relentless search for a cure for their shame. The first stop was the Advanced Development Clinic, a glass and steel building in an upscale neighborhood. The interior smelled of disinfectant and ambition. Dr. Alencar, a woman with a clinical smile and an impeccable suit, spoke in terms of intervention, protocols, and behavior modulation. Ilara's sessions took place in a white, windowless room equipped with cameras. Beatrice and Ricardo watched through a one-way mirror. They saw young, anxious therapists trying to force Ilara to make eye contact, to stack blocks in a predetermined order, to point to pictures on cards. Ilara resisted. She cowered, hid under the table. The therapists wrote on their clipboards, "Uncooperative behavior." After 3 months and an exorbitant amount of money, the only change in Ilara was the terror she displayed whenever they got in the car. The second stop was a famous neurologist who promised an innovative drug treatment. He barely looked at Ilara. He analyzed the reports and prescribed a cocktail of antipsychotics and mood stabilizers. For a few weeks, Ilara was calm. The calm was a state of numbness, of sedation. She stopped rocking, but she also stopped showing any interest in her only comforts: the sunlight on the wall, the textures of her blankets. She just existed, a ghost in her own home. For Ricardo and Beatrice, their drugged daughter was easier to manage, but impossible to present in public. The calm was as strange as the crises. The last attempt was a wellness guru who suggested intensive sound immersion therapy to recalibrate her neural pathways. They took her to a dark room where giant headphones emitted strange and dissonant sounds. Ilara's reaction was so violent, such a deep crisis, that they had to flee the place. Each failure cemented their belief. She was a lost cause, incorrigible. Their attempts to help her were never about understanding Ilara's world. They were attempts to force Ilara into their world. When all attempts failed, the only solution left was not to accept her, but to remove her from the equation. The first 48 hours at Silas's house were a silent battle between trauma and patience. Silas's house was the opposite of the city apartment. It smelled of wood, damp earth, and stale coffee. Light filtered softly through dusty, curtainless windows. There were no sharp angles, only the gentle curve of wooden furniture worn smooth by use. For Ilara, however, it was just a new kind of terror. She curled up in the darkest corner of the small room, behind an old armchair, and refused to come out. She didn't eat, drink, or sleep. She just stayed there, a frightened little animal in a trap. Silas didn't try to approach her. He didn't push. He accepted her corner as her territory and respected her boundaries. He continued his routine as if nothing had changed. He talked to her, even without expecting a response. His voice was a low, calm murmur, like the wind in the trees. "Good morning, little bird. I made some porridge. I'll leave it here on the table if you get hungry. I'm going to tend the garden now. The house is all yours. Night is coming. You don't need to be afraid of the dark here. The dark here is a friend." He prepared simple meals: oatmeal, porridge, vegetable soup, homemade bread, and left them on a small table near the armchair without making a fuss. Hours later, he would collect the untouched plate, showing no frustration. The conflict wasn't with Ilara. It was with her silence, with the fear that enveloped her like a shroud. Anyone else would have despaired, would have tried a more direct approach. Silas, however, understood the language of the earth, of skittish animals, of seeds that need time to germinate. He knew that trust cannot be harvested by force. It needs to be cultivated. He spent his days outside in his garden, fixing a fence, feeding the chickens. He worked in silence, always within sight of Ilara, in case she dared to peek through the window. He wasn't just giving her space. He was becoming part of the landscape, a constant, predictable, and safe presence. He was waiting for her to understand that he was not a threat, but just another part of that new and quiet world. The turning point came on the 4th day. It was not a dramatic moment. It was such a small and quiet event that anyone else might not have noticed. The morning sun was warm, and Silas was in the chicken coop, a simple enclosure near an old mulberry tree. He was scattering corn on the ground, and the chickens were pecking around him, clucking softly. Ilara, for the first time, had come out of her hiding place. She stood in the doorway of the back of the house, about 20 feet away, watching. Her arms were crossed tightly against her chest, a small statue of mistrust. Silas saw her but made no move toward her. He continued his task. There was one chicken in particular, a brown guinea fowl that was tamer than the others. He called her Dust. Silas crouched down, picked up a handful of corn, and held out his hand. Dust approached and began pecking at the kernels in his palm. Then, very slowly, Silas looked in Ilara's direction. Their eyes met for a second. He didn't smile. He just kept his gaze calm. He took another handful of corn and, with an almost imperceptibly slow movement, held out his open hand toward her. a silent invitation. He didn't expect her to come closer, but to his surprise, she took a step out of the house, then another. Her bare feet made hardly a sound on the hard earth. She stopped a few feet away from him, still hesitant. Silas remained crouched, motionless. Only his outstretched hand remained as a bridge between them. Ilara looked at his hand, at the corn, at the chicken eating, peacefully. It took a whole minute. Then she took the last few steps. She extended her own trembling hand, palm up. Silas, with infinite care, poured a few grains of corn into her small hand. Ilara stood frozen, feeling the weight and texture of the grains. Poera, the chicken, approached her and began to peck at her hand. The soft feathers on the chicken's head brushed against her fingers. The beak was hard, but it didn't hurt. A tremor ran through Ilara's body, but it wasn't fear. It was discovery. A new texture, a life that didn't threaten her. She didn't look at Silas, but he saw. He saw the tension in her shoulders ease a millimeter. That was the first brick in the building of trust. He didn't force her to interact with him, an unpredictable human. He invited her to interact with something she could understand, a creature of routine, of instinct, of nature. He didn't speak her language, but he showed that he respected her dialect. After the day with the chicken, the ice began to melt, not in a flood, but in a slow and steady drip. The victories were small, but for Silas, they were monumental. The first was when he left the bowl of porridge on the table, and when he returned, saw that half of it had been eaten. He said nothing, just smiled to himself as he washed the bowl. A few days later, Ilara came out from behind the armchair and sat on the porch step, watching him work in the garden. She spent the entire afternoon there, just watching. At the end of the day, Silas picked a ripe, red, shiny strawberry. He washed it at the outside tap and placed it on the step next to her. He went inside. 20 minutes later, the strawberry was gone. A week later, a heavy storm swept through the region. In the city apartment, the thunder echoing between the buildings would have been a nightmare for Ilara. In the small wooden house, the sound was different, more muffled, part of nature. Silas found her huddled, trembling. He didn't hug her. He just took 2 rocking chairs and placed them on the covered porch. "Let's watch the rain, little bird," he said. They sat side by side, silently, as the sky lit up with lightning and the rain fell in curtains. He pointed to each flash of lightning and, a few seconds later, counted to the thunder. "Here it comes. 1, 2, 3. The sound became a game, an expectation, not a threat. Ilara stopped shaking. Her large, dark eyes followed the rays of light, fascinated. The biggest victory came a month later. Silas was fixing the handle of an old metal bucket. The handle slipped from his hand and hit the side of the bucket, producing a loud, unexpected clang. Ilara, who was nearby, jumped and put her hands over her ears. But instead of running away, she looked at him. In her eyes, there was a question. Silas picked up a small hammer and deliberately tapped the bucket. Clang. He looked at her and smiled. Then he handed her the hammer. Ilara took it. She hesitated for a moment, then tapped the bucket. Clang. A sound she had created herself. A sound she controlled. She tapped again and again. A rhythm began to emerge. And then, for the first time since she had arrived, a sound came out of her mouth. It wasn't a word, but a laugh. A rusty, low sound, but unmistakably a laugh. Silas felt his eyes water. He wasn't teaching her to speak. He was giving her back her voice. One night, long after Ilara had fallen asleep, Silas sat on the porch, the only sound being the crickets and the gentle wind. He stared into the darkness where he knew his crops were growing in silence and thought of her parents. At first, he had felt a cold, hard anger at their cruelty, their cowardice. But the anger had dissipated, replaced by something much deeper, an immense, heartbreaking pity. They weren't monsters. They were just poor in spirit, poor in perception. They had in their hands the rarest of flowers, a wild orchid that needed very specific conditions to bloom, and they tried, by force, to make it grow in a plastic pot under artificial light. They blamed the flower for not adapting, never realizing that the problem was the environment they were providing. He thought of his late wife, Marta. She loved the garden more than anything. She used to say, "You don't yell at a seed to make it grow faster, Silas. You don't curse it for needing more shade or more water. You learn what it needs, and you give it to it. That's what love is. It's attention and patience. The rest is just gardening. He looked at the window of the small room where Alara slept. He hadn't done anything special. He had no techniques, no therapies, no diplomas. He had just paid attention. He had given her silence when she needed silence, space when she needed space, and a tame chicken when she needed a friend who didn't ask questions. He understood that the love those parents were looking for was a mirror love, one that reflected well on them. True love, the love he felt for that silent girl, was not a mirror. It was a window to another soul, an invitation to look and understand a world different from his own. And he felt like the richest man in the world for being allowed to look through Alara's window. 2 years passed. The red dust from the road rose again. The same German sedan, now a newer model, stopped in front of the gate. Ricardo and Beatrice got out of the car. They looked older, more tired. A legal formality, a signature necessary for continued custody, had brought them back. They expected to find the same cowering, frightened child. What they saw left them speechless. Alara, now 9 years old, stood barefoot in the middle of the garden, next to Silas. She wasn't dirty. She was covered in dirt. Her hair, longer now, was tied back in a simple ponytail. She moved with a calmness and confidence that were completely new. She was carefully transplanting a tomato seedling. When she saw the car, she didn't flinch. She stopped what she was doing and looked up. Then her gaze moved to Silas, seeking his guidance. He just nodded slightly. Beatrice tried to force a motherly smile. Alara, sweetheart, it's us, Mommy and Daddy. Her voice sounded strange, artificial in that environment. Alara looked at them, a long, inscrutable gaze. There was no anger in her eyes, no joy. There was only distance. Ricardo, trying to fill the awkward silence, said, "You look well. This place has done you good. We did the right thing." He still needed to believe that. Alara bent down and picked something up from the ground. She walked slowly toward them. For a moment, Beatrice thought she would receive a hug, but Alara stopped at a safe distance and held out her hand. In the palm of her hand was a stone, a river stone, perfectly smooth gray with white veins warmed by the sun. It was one of her treasures. She offered it to Beatrice. It was a gift, a communication, a statement. It was the only language she could offer them. Beatrice took the stone, not knowing what to do with it. "Thank you, dear," she said, her voice faltering. Alara said nothing. She just turned and walked back to the garden, stopping beside Silas. She didn't take his hand but stood close, shoulder to shoulder. The message was clear. This was her place. This was her home. Ricardo and Beatrice stood there for a moment longer, holding the smooth stone, perhaps understanding for the first time the immensity of what they had lost. They got into the car and drove away, leaving behind a world they would never be able to understand. Silas put his hand on Alara's shoulder, and the two stood watching the cloud of dust disappear on the horizon, the silence between them filled with everything that words could never express. Some souls are not made for the noise of the world. They flourish in silence, in patience, in the fertile soil of unquestioning love. They need a gardener, not an architect. If this story reminded you that the most powerful love is often the quietest, join us. Comment below with a simple "I hear you" to celebrate all those who communicate beyond words. Sign up so you don't miss any stories and share this video. You could be the person who reminds someone today that every living being, no matter how different, deserves a safe place to put down roots and grow.